So I wanted to make a short video about what I learned making the first album. I wrote the album over a series of time, vocals, music, whatnot. And I played, with the exception of one track, everything myself. I wrote all the vocals myself. I did all the production myself initially. And it took a while. And then when I went to send it for mastering, and if you don't know what mastering is about, we'll talk about that maybe later. The engineer told me, you know, if you'd really like this to be professional, we really ought to remix this. And I said, okay, fine. I mean, it wasn't going to be for free, but I said, fine. And you might say, well, what does it cost to do an album if you have somebody else mix and master it? My experience is about $5,000 for an album of about 9 songs, which is what Aliennation is. Anyway, so I sat with the engineer for a couple of weeks, as it turned out, and we went through it. And the final product was so different, so much better, that what I learned were 2 things. The first thing was, I probably shouldn't ever try to mix anything myself. And again, we'll talk about in a moment that. But the second thing was that you have to focus on certain things in the studio and other things you don't have to focus on. What do you have to focus on in the studio? Well, the number one thing you need to focus on is getting quality recordings. And that means if you're doing vocals, having a decent mic. If you're playing guitar, play your guitar well, or get somebody else to play it for you well. Keep things in key. And if you have those basics, then you can take those and make a decent album out of them. The other thing I learned was that you needed to have enough of a knowledge of mixing to be able to at least create a rough mix. And the reason I say that is because when you go into the studio and the mixing engineer looks at your stuff, the very first thing he's going to do is drop all the faders and get rid of all the plugins. And everything you work so hard for is gone. There are ways to keep some of it, but again, we'll talk about that later. So what you need is to be able to have a rough mix so that at least the engineer hears what you intended. So if you intended those background vocals to come in softly and build, if you intended your organ to go a certain way, if you intended a certain amount of reverb, all that kind of stuff, you want to have that on a rough mix. And then two of you can talk about it and then let him do what he does, because he'll have better stuff than you do, probably, unless you are a mixing engineer. And if you are, God bless you. The last thing I learned is you don't need to invest in a lot of production plugins and software unless that, again, you're a mixing engineer or you're really into that. Or your music just aligns itself with that. I hear a lot of music on Bandcamp and I hear it and I think, man, that could have really used a better mix. But you don't need to invest. You just need to invest in enough to get your rough mix. So for me, I'm not going to invest in Isotope and Manly, software for mastering and all of that, because somebody else is going to do it, and they're going to do it much better than I am. So those are some things I learned making the first album. Hopefully this is helpful to you. Next time, we're going to talk a little bit about my studio, a little bit about the setup, and a little bit about device. Cheers.